Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 1st, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And just like with every single episode, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way we keep this show going, now on episode 566 in our 11th year, is by relying on support of individuals just like you. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Chuck Blell, Daniel Lang, David J. E. Smith, Joseph Lamore, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's dive right into it. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Christine E. Webb, previously in Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. She's recently moved over to environmental studies at NYU. She's actually a primatologist with expertise in social behavior, cognition, and emotion, and typically works with non-human primates in different settings, like from the field and beyond, and really collaborating in a multidisciplinary way with scientists and scholars from, the humanities to the social sciences and beyond. And she has a new book out. Big surprise. Every week we have a really interesting scientist or science writer with a new book out. This one's really exciting. Okay, so it's called The Arrogant Ape: The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. So we're going to talk about primates, about non-human primates, but we're also going to talk about ourselves and some of the ways that we have thought about ourselves in relation to the entire animal kingdom of which we are a part, and to nature and ecology as a whole. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Christine E. Webb. Well, Christine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your new book, The Arrogant Ape: The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. Is this your first book?
It is my first book, yes.
That's like a really big deal.
Thank you.
I talked to a lot of authors on the show. And honestly, like a lot of first authors. I myself have been grappling with or toying with the idea of writing a book, and it is so overwhelmingly daunting to me. And I'm just always in awe of people who have full-time careers, especially in the sciences, and also write a trade publication, like a popular science book as well. How, I just got to ask before we even get into like your background and stuff, what was it like for you, like really making that decision and jumping in?
Well, first of all, thank you for emphasizing the importance of a debut book, because so many people ask what I'm going to write about in my second book. And I'm like,
jeez, you're like, hello, I need a break.
It hasn't even come out yet. Can we just enjoy this moment for at least a month or so? So I appreciate that. And
of course.
Yeah, I feel so privileged that I got to write this book, honestly. And it was one of those things, probably more so than any other time in my career. I just knew I had to do it. It almost didn't feel like a choice. And that really helped because, of course, as you have already realized, writing a book is a huge commitment. It's very daunting. There's so many ups and downs. And I just had this certainty that I needed to do it, and that I was very lucky to be able to do it. And that really pulled me through some of the harder moments.
And that's huge too. Like I have a lot of, not just professional acquaintances, but I have a lot of really, really good friends who are science writers. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that I hear from them all the time is write the book or write the piece or write the article that only you could write. And that's like a really, because a lot of people are like, what do I write about? What do I write about? Well, if, a million people, no, what is it that you know? What is the information inside of you that's like bursting to get out? And obviously, anybody who sits down to write a book, especially somebody who I think comes from an area of expertise where you're trained in the sciences, where you've, dedicated a pretty large portion of your life to, I guess, cultivating that expertise, you have a lot of knowledge, but you still have to do what we think of in journalism as traditional reporting to be able to write a book like this. You still have to dig deep. You still have to either learn or relearn things in order to communicate them well to an audience. So was it like fun for you? Did it feel like a slog at times to kind of go back and to dig deep and to try and not only remember things that you learned previously, but learn new things to be able to completely tell the story?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. And I think it is important to feel like, to some extent, you and only you could write this book. But I think it's equally important that you just care so much about the message and about the idea, and that you, in my case, felt that it was valuable to others or to the world. And so you're doing it for yourself, but you're also keeping others in mind and the extent to which perhaps it could change their worldview or their way of being in the world. And so that also, again, helped me through some of the more difficult periods. But yeah, I also, as a trained scientist, have often, been told or trained to keep myself out of the research, right? To remove myself from what is actually being done. And that's the way that a lot of scientific writing is done as well. If you read an academic paper, you won't really see much about the researcher in there. And that was a difficult journey for me, to start writing in a way that would be accessible to a broader audience, to put myself back into the research, to share my own emotions, intentions, dreams, and experiences, which are really a big part of this book, and what I think helps lend, color to the other stories and the data that are in there. And but that process, that took me about 2 years to find my voice. And I read some of my original book proposal. It sounds so academic, and at the time I thought it didn't sound academic at all. I thought it was like I was doing great, but I read it now and I'm just like, wow, that I was so far away from it. So yeah, that was a process, and a really important one. I think it's actually improved my scientific or academic writing as well, and made it a bit more interesting.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Absolutely. Yeah. I think I came across a study recently that looked at, journal articles, published peer-reviewed studies over the last several decades, and concluded pretty unequivocally that they are getting denser and harder to read. That sort of the scientese that we all speak, right, it is just getting worse and worse. And anybody who has ever worked in the SciComm community, who sort of like walked over that line and does public speaking or does outreach within their communities, works with their local museums, writes public trade publications, they know that sort of you get deeply trained during your academic career, and then you have to unlearn all of these really bad habits of just relying on the specialized lexicon and writing in that super dense way that, the shorthand is helpful for other scientists. But my view, and I can imagine that you are with me on this, just looking at sort of your background and your meandering path to primatology, we are interdisciplinary now. We can't not be. And I'm sorry, there are going to be people from fields that are wildly different or kind of similar, but hey, they were trained in the biology department, not the psychology department. So now they don't know any of the words you're using, or they approached it in a slightly different way. So now nothing we say makes sense. We have to be more inclusive in how we write.
Yeah, completely. There is a pretty high profile science journal called Proceedings B, and it's one of the most widely cited journals. And when you compare it to other journals of similar caliber, it still seems to get more citations than the others. And one reason for this, I suspect, is that the word count is very low. I don't even know what it is, but relative to other scientific journals, you have to be very concise, to the point. There's not much room for jargon. It's just, and I think as a result, it really speaks across disciplines, and it becomes a more accessible journal for, and again, scientists, like many people, are strapped for time. And so they want to be able to see what was done in a few thousand words as opposed to, 8 to 10,000 words. And so, yeah, there's evidence out there that those kinds of more short form, to the point, direct scientific articles actually get more citations, despite this other trend that you're describing, that we're becoming more and more inaccessible sometimes in our language.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. And I think that, there are so many great pioneers who are writing in the public science communication space, who are making really incredible content, whether it be like YouTube content or even like glossy produced television shows. It's on the mind right now because last night I was at our local Natural History Museum. I moderated a panel with a friend and colleague, Shane Campbell-Staton, who does this beautiful show on PBS called Human Footprint. And we were really talking about these very ideas, the relationship between humans and non-human animals, the sort of, we're going to get into so many of these things. And I was just, I don't know, I sat back and I took it all in, and I was like, oh, I'm so proud of all of these incredible people telling these really important stories. And so I'm just so glad you're here, because I think that your career path is fascinating to me. Our career paths overlap a little bit, but then they also diverge in a major way. So we're both trained as psychologists, which is fascinating. I'm very, very clinical. You have psychology training that kind of really allows you to situate yourself in a very multidisciplinary way. So help the listeners now understand what you studied in school and how that sort of prepared you for the academic path that you were on.
Sure. Yeah. Well, part of it was just structural in the US in particular. If you're interested in working with other animals, studying animal behavior, you can end up in any number of different departments, just depending on where the primatologists and ethologists and zoologists are housed at that particular university. So in some universities, they're in the anthropology department. In some universities, they're in the biology department. In my undergrad institution, which was Emory University, the people who studied other animals were mostly, and studied other animal behaviors, were mostly in the psychology department. And when I look back on my training in psychology, I'm in a way very grateful for that I guess just coincidence that the people in the field that I was interested in happened to be in a psychology department, because all along, since I was a very young girl, frankly, I've been interested in what other animals are thinking and feeling. And it was, and it still is, fascinating to me to just sit there and watch their behavior. But from their behavior, I would always want to know what is going on in their minds. And unlike the neurosciences, which I think are really focused on brains and how brains relate to behavior, I was interested in subjective experience, in mentality, and what is going on in the interior lives of these individuals. And so in many ways, by borrowing theories, concepts, ideas from psychology, which has been traditionally focused on human beings and not other beings, I was more equipped, I think, to ask some of those questions than I would be had I been in a biology department or an anthropology department.
It is fascinating how when you read books by different primatologists, they really do seem to come from a lot of different angles and different areas. And you're right, like I think about my own training. I did my undergrad in psychology, and then I did my PhD in psychology, but I did my master's in between in like really central in a biology department. It was a neuroscience-y master's degree, but it was, heavy biology. And I do think that my training was incredibly human-centric. I do remember some conversations about animal studies and psychology and some kind of early paradigm stuff, but it feels like that was all very like history and systems of psychology training, and not a lot of like modern ecological training. But I wonder if people who do like a cognitive science degree, or people who are in a more research focused psychology degree, or I shouldn't say mine was too, but like without the clinical component, do you get more of that non-human animal training, or do you think that that's actually kind of rare now?
Yeah, I think it really depends on where you are. The
Mm-hmm.
places where you would get that more that less human centric training
Mm-hmm.
would perhaps be in comparative psychology departments,
Mm.
where I mean the goal there is to explicitly compare typically the cognitive abilities of humans to other species, and in particular our closest non-human primate relatives. But as you know, I explore in the book, I think even many of those comparative psychology training programs end up being very human centric in their own
Mm-hmm.
right, because they're often trying to show what makes human cognition unique, or that is often the results of some of these studies. And are these studies fair comparisons in the first place? You know, if it's comparative psychology, we should be comparing the most representative samples we possibly can of humans and other primates. But in many comparative psychology programs, you're comparing the abilities of fully autonomous human beings with captive great apes, for instance. And that is
Yeah.
not a fair way of comparing psychology. So, yeah, I guess with what I'm saying is that it really depends on the particular department and space where you are. I think comparative psychology would be the place where you would get that more multi-species, angle and approach. But even within those places, they can be human centric as well.
Yeah, I'm curious how one even studies this, and obviously that's the sort of the content versus the process aspect of your work. I'd love to get into some of the process, because you mentioned something that I was going to ask next, right? Is are you observing these apes in their natural habitat? Is there even such a thing much as natural habitat anymore? Are you observing them in captivity, or what we might call in the wild now, which really is mostly it's wildlife is mostly managed now, but that doesn't mean it's not still in the wild.
Right.
And are you more interested in those kinds of behaviors of wild apes? Because I can imagine they're pretty different.
Certainly, yeah. And I've worked with other primates in many different settings. I think almost all the different categories that you could have worked with them in
Mm.
labs, in zoos, and in sanctuaries, and in what we call the wild. Today, I'm only interested in studying them in the wild and in sanctuaries, both for ethical and scientific reasons. I think my background, having studied them in all of these different settings, really taught me, indeed, what you're saying, which is that captive individuals, let's say captive chimpanzees, are nothing like their wild counterparts, because
Mm.
these individuals, like human beings, are shaped by their social and physical environments. And if their social and physical environments are incredibly deprived, as they are in most, if not all, captive settings, then it's really hard to ask and address questions in a valid way about their social and emotional lives and their cognition as well. So, again, I think there are many, many ethical reasons for only studying them in places where they have more autonomy. But I think there are
Yeah.
very good scientific ones as well. And I guess that's sort of how I would even though the wild, what is the wild these days? Because so much of what we do is if not managed by humans, then influenced by humans. But I would say maybe a key difference is, do these individuals have autonomy over their lives and over their choices to some degree, right? And
Yeah.
that is an obvious difference between great apes, for instance, living in a zoo versus in their natural habitats.
And of course, I'm already doing the thing, which I think we're going to try and flag throughout our conversation today, where I'm trying to come up with, because as a psychologist, but also just as an arrogant ape, I'm trying to come up with some sort of like human analogy to that, right? Like, oh, it's as if you're studying, individuals, who are imprisoned, or individuals who are in some sort of like high control authoritarian situation, as opposed to individuals who have a lot of free will and can make a lot of their own decisions.
Yeah.
Of course, these apes that are in captivity are not going to be displaying a lot of volitional behaviors. They're going to be, maybe some of them will be, but they're probably going to be a lot of like reactive behaviors as opposed to, choice-oriented behaviors.
Certainly. And I mean, I don't think you're being an arrogant ape at all. If anything, I think that's a humble perspective, because you're recognizing that we would never deem it appropriate to study humans in prisons as the benchmark for human cognition. And yet that's what we do with other animals all the time. And aside from, lacking their own volition, often, I mean, these animals are highly stressed. They do studies of post-mortem, brains of zoo animals or animals who've been in captivity, and they show that they have often severe brain damage. And so, we are often using these as the sort of yardstick of animal cognition, especially in comparative psychology. And it's just, it's not good science. It's not good science to do it that way.
And so I'm curious, obviously in your career, you've asked a lot of different questions. I'd love to hear a little, before we dive into some of the things that you highlight in the book. I'd love to hear what your dissertation research was focused on, and then sort of what you're doing. I know you're in a transitional state with your career because you're moving academic appointments from one institution to another. But what kinds of questions you're asking, kind of within your lab currently?
Sure. Yeah. So my dissertation research focused on a particular social behavior. I've always been interested in social behavior in other animals and in humans, in part because I actually think that looking at sociality is one of the best windows into understanding the minds of each other and of other species. And so I was interested in a particular social behavior called reconciliation. And I studied this behavior actually in my dissertation in both chimpanzees and in humans. And reconciliation in primatology is typically defined as post-conflict contact between former opponents. That's the kind of standard, maybe jargony.
So what is that?
It's kind of another way of putting it, friendly reunions between former opponents. So after a conflict, an aggressive bout, let's say between two individual chimpanzees, they might come together again in a friendly way, start grooming one another, touch one another in a reassuring way, share food with one another, engage in friendly contact that research has shown does serve to restore the relationship to baseline levels of tolerance and affinity. And I was really interested in what kind of motivated this behavior, which individuals do it. Are there individual differences? Do some individuals reconcile more than others? And is that also true in humans, which there have been studies on individual differences in forgiveness in humans, but not necessarily in reconciliation. And I think those are different things. I think forgiveness is about, kind of overcoming this negative sentiment that you might have towards someone, whereas reconciliation is really about restoring a relationship. You can forgive someone, but choose not to continue the relationship. So actually, this was a good example of where a concept that had been relatively well researched in the animal world, in primatology, had not really been studied as much in humans. Reconciliation had been studied between groups and nations, but not necessarily between individuals. And so I was really inspired by the primate research to look at individual differences in reconciliation in humans. And what I ended up showing in my dissertation was that the motivation to reconcile, well, first of all, that there are individual differences in the motivation to reconcile, and that those differences are in part attributable to a broader motivation that individuals have for change. And that motivation for change is called locomotion. It was developed by my PhD supervisor, Tori Higgins, to describe this tendency to just change states. If you're in a negative state, you want to go to a positive state. If you are still, you want to move. And so, that is my dissertation in a nutshell. It's been a while
That's
since I
so
spoke about it.
I love that. It's so funny because it reminds me of something that a neighbor of mine once said. This is such a random like connection. My brain works in a weird way, but I remember talking to a neighbor of mine once about like how hard it is to wake up in the morning, but also how hard it is to go to sleep at night, and how some people are morning people, some people are night people. And I remember my neighbor said something like, "I just want to stay in whatever state I'm in, So if like I'm up late, like enjoying myself, I just never want to go to bed. But then once I'm in bed, I never want to get out." And I
Oh,
was like, that's
wow.
really funny. But of course, I think there is this, and granted, it's probably not innate. It's probably like learned because of our capitalist system that we live in. But this kind of movement towards something, or this kind of feeling of like, I got to be doing, I've got to be making progress, or I've got to be changing in some sort of way, evolving in some sort of way. That's really interesting. But I'm also curious because, I can imagine when we talk about primates as a whole, like as a broad group, there's a lot of difference, right? Like even my, naive knowledge of apes, which there aren't that many great ape species, that like bonobos, for example, have very different social behaviors in some aspects to chimpanzees, and they're almost the same genetically.
Yeah, actually, this kind of gets to your second question, which is what am I working on
Mm.
today? And because of my longstanding interest in social behavior, one of the things that I have been looking at recently is within species variation in sociality. And so, what I mean by that broadly is that we have these understandings of chimpanzee social behavior as being distinct from bonobo social behavior. The kind of general differences that are relatively well understood is that chimpanzees tend to be more aggressive, male dominated, whereas bonobos tend to be more tolerant and matriarchal. They
And
use
sexy.
sex, yeah, the sexy ape, as everybody calls them. Um, One of my current research projects that I've been doing in collaboration with a student named Jake Brooker, a colleague Xana Clay, is to compare the behaviors of different groups of chimpanzees and bonobos across different sanctuaries. And one thing that we find, and this is actually also something that is being discovered in the wild now, is that there's so much within species variation within bonobos and chimpanzees that some groups of bonobos actually look more chimpanzee-like. They seem a bit more
Mm.
aggressive. And some groups of chimpanzees look a little bit more bonobo-like. And actually, male chimpanzees engage in sociosexual behavior with each other much more often than previously understood. So we have these kind of stereotypes about chimpanzees and bonobos, uh, which to some extent are, have been based on data. But when you look within these species at different groups, and as more and more data become available, there's just also so much within species variation. So you're right that there's much variation within the great apes, but then even within a single species, there's so much variation that can depend on any number of social and environmental factors. So that's one big area that I'm working on now. And then the other big area that also has to do with social behavior, although I think people are often surprised that I'm talking about it as a social
Mm.
behavior, is birth. So
Hmm.
a big project right now is animal pregnancy and birth, and how, in terms of thinking about cognitive questions, like, do other animals have a concept of birth? Do they know that they are pregnant? And if you think
Oh,
about it, birth is
interesting.
this like profoundly social event, right? It's a profoundly
Yeah.
social event. This individual comes out of the body of another individual, smells different, looks different, moves different. How does the birthing individual and all of the individuals in the group, how do they make sense of that event? And these are questions that, to my knowledge, have not been addressed yet. And it's really fascinating to me because birth is such a fundamental life history event, and yet there's hardly any research on it. So that's another big area that a direction that my research is going in these days.
Now, I am going to make a meta comment right now that you can either quietly nod or shake your head to, or you can comment on. I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position.
Yeah.
But as I'm listening to what you're saying about these really interesting questions that you're asking currently, and especially as you were reflecting on the fact that we're now starting to see that, like, male chimpanzees engage in more kind of sexual, like sociosexual, sexuo-social, I don't know what the word you used is, behavior than previously kind of understood. And then you moved on to talk about sort of the psychology and the sociology of birth within these primate species. I cannot help but just reflect on the fact that so much of this has everything to do with the fact that most of these scientific fields have been dominated by men for so long. And it's
Yeah.
like this social, not even question, this social truism that science, yes, is the best system we have to try to understand objective reality, but it is still done by people, and there are still deep biases within our scientific methods of inquiry. And the fact that the fields are becoming more and more, or having more and more gender parity, even though we're still not there yet in certain fields, we have a long way to go. We see changes in the research questions that are being asked, and it actually dramatically affects our pool of knowledge. You are a woman scientist, and like, I hate to even have to use that label because you are a scientist, but you're asking questions that I'm afraid that historically men never even thought to ask.
Yeah, I mean, definitely nodding in agreement over here, and I think it's um, fascinating because primatology is actually one of those fields where women have had a major impact. If you look at the number of, in terms of scientific fields, I don't know if there have been studies on this, but primatology is dominated by women actually,
Mm,
and that I think is in part thanks to icons like Jane Goodall and
yeah,
Diane Fossey and these other women primatologists who really showed the way. But what is
yeah,
fascinating, and this is a commonly referenced anecdote about Jane Goodall, is that she actually wasn't a traditionally trained scientist. She went out into the field for the first time without a PhD, without formal training in observing primate behavior. And that was the intentional on behalf of her advisor, the person who sent her there, Louis Leakey, because he wanted her to have an open mind. And I don't think it's any coincidence that, she made all of these really important and amazing discoveries about their social behavior and their tool use and their hunting. So all to say that is I completely agree with you. And it's fascinating to me, though, that even within a field like primatology, which has had, I think, more equal representation than many, if not most, STEM fields, there seem to be these questions, understandings that have been overlooked. And it's just a testament to the fact that, yeah, science is shaped by sociocultural values and norms and the values and norms at that time. And so even if there's women who are, in the field, maybe there's not enough interest in questions about pregnancy and birth because we're still, living in a patriarchal society where those values are dominant and sort of what gets rewarded in science.
100%.
The
Yeah, I
question,
think,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, the sort of water that we're swimming in is still very heavily shaped, and still, even in fields like, I'm a clinical psychologist, like, we're all women, you know what I mean? Like, it's like really dominated by women, but still, when you look at sort of the structure,
yeah,
especially in an academic setting, like the people at the tippy top are still mostly men.
yeah.
The
The
gatekeepers
gatekeepers.
are often men. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that a lot of times, at least early in the kind of transition to women, getting PhDs. This is not a very new thing, right? To women getting PhDs and women sort of existing within academic settings, there was almost a pressure to be like the men. I'm saying that in quotes, to
yeah,
like not rock the boat too much and to ask palatable questions that sort of our male supervisors were okay with. And so, yeah, it's a slow and steady climb, but I think I'm just so excited to hear about your research because I think it's just super important,
yeah,
and just really validating to hear that these important questions that matter to, I think the whole population and the whole population of, the whole ecology of our planet, but also specifically to that solid 50% that often whose voice often isn't represented within the sciences.
yeah.
It's just really important. So, A, thank you for asking these questions, and B, What are some of the kind of cool findings that you've been stumbling upon lately?
Oh, for sure. I also, just before we move on, I want to flag this
Hmm.
other amazing book called Bitch by Lucy Cook. If you haven't heard
Oh,
it or read
oh
it.
no. I think we've had Lucy on the show.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I'm with you on that. Yeah. It's so I try to
Exactly.
highlight that kind of stuff as often as possible.
Yeah, definitely. So she's, kind of reconsidering, taking another look at all of these assumptions that we have in biology about how behavior works, and showing that if you take
Mm.
a female perspective, then there's a lot of assumptions that we've made that are wrong and misrepresenting a species behavior. So what have I found? Wow, uh, so much. But I guess I'll focus on this birth stuff because it's the project that's the most exciting to me
Hmm.
at the moment. And I think one of the most interesting things, coming back to my claim that most people will maybe be surprised to think about birth in a social way, because I feel like when primatologists talk about birth, they typically assume that it happens in isolation. So a female will go off and you won't see her for a few days, and that's often when you know that maybe she's very pregnant and about to give birth, and then she
Mm.
comes back to the group and she has an individual with her. And while that is certainly true of many primates, that they do tend to give birth in isolation, and there's all sorts of reasons why that might be adaptive. Um, there are many examples of other primates giving birth in a social context. And there's even examples of birthing behaviors where individuals are helping the laboring individual birth. So they're acting almost as midwives. And there are
Hmm.
papers that actually use that term, like midwifery, to describe.
Hmm.
So in bonobos, I think both in the wild and in captive settings, there have been other females who surround the parturient, the individual giving birth, and facilitate the birth process. And it's pretty assumed that that kind of social assistance is not a biological requirement in these species. It's thought to be a biological requirement in humans for all sorts of anatomical reasons that I won't bore you with. But it's thought to, midwifery or social assistance is thought to be a requirement in human beings, but not in other species. But there are more and more data points that are kind of challenging these assumptions. And so I'm really, again, interested in the kind of this social dimensions of birth, and
Hmm.
how they can reveal so much about an individual's mind. So one of the questions we're really interested in primatology is, do others help do individuals help other individuals in an instrumental way? So do they do things that they know are necessary to help that particular individual, like share a particular tool that will help that individual get termites out of a mound, and they'll share the right size tool and the right shape tool? Well, I think midwifery is a really cool example of a behavior that would suggest that these individuals know what kind of support and help that other individual needs. And so it's just one of many examples of how I think these behaviors lend a lot of interesting insights to what's going on in their minds and with their emotions.
Oh, I love that so much. You know, I want to get to the thesis of the book. I feel like I have to jump around so much because I've got a million questions
No worries.
and not enough time. Because I'm, obviously I'm going to ask you a question that we're going to put a pin in. So
Okay.
I'm just doing this to hold myself to account. But like, how in the hell do you understand the inner world of an organism that cannot communicate to you with language?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great
obviously,
question.
yeah, that's like a huge important question,
Huge
right? But
question. Yeah.
but also the title of your book, The Arrogant Ape, right? This is incredibly provocative title, the myth of human exceptionalism and why it matters. This is near and dear to my heart. I am a psychologist. I am also an atheist. I am also a humanist. I have a very strong, uh, I'd call it even an ideology
Mm.
that, we happen to evolve certain, uh, brain structures in a very particular way that happen to allow us to have language, that then happen to allow us to have, contemplation and symbolic interactionism, and be able to sit and think about our place in the universe, which is incredible.
Mm.
We are not somehow more special. I do not believe we were endowed by God. I do not believe that we have any sort of maybe I'll call it a privilege, but
Mhm.
definitely not some sort of, we are not owed anything by this world that, let's say, a chimpanzee is not.
Right.
But I also think that throughout all of scientific, historical scientific literature and popular literature, we're talked about like we are way different. Like
Mm.
we are human, they are animals. And that's even
Mm.
why I conscientiously said non-human animals at the beginning of this conversation. So is that really what you're getting at in this book? Like, talk to me about this idea of the myth of human exceptionalism.
Yeah, I think what you are describing really gets at this difference, this tension between what some would call human uniqueness and
Mm,
human exceptionalism. So, in the book, I am not arguing that humans are not unique. I
mhm,
think that humans may well be unique, but I also think that gorillas are unique and that dragonflies are unique. What makes human exceptionalism different from something like human uniqueness is what you're saying that you don't align with, which I agree with, is that what makes humans unique somehow makes them more morally worthy than other species or more advanced than other species. So while we might have some more advanced abilities in certain domains, does that necessarily make us more advanced evolutionarily overall? Well, that doesn't make any evolutionary sense to me. We're all the tips of the evolutionary tree, right? We have all extant species are equally evolved. And so I think, and I'd be curious to know whether you agree with what I'm about to say,
mm,
which is that I do not where I think that humans may be unique. I do not necessarily think that humans are uniquely intelligent
mhm,
compared to other species. And just because we have a certain kind of language or a certain kind of thought, that doesn't necessarily make us more intelligent than other species. And I think that, when you think about the history of the idea of human exceptionalism, going all the way back to Aristotle and, Greek and Hellenistic philosophy to modern times, a lot of it focuses on the human mind, the human intellect, human capacity for language and rationality that makes them unique. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree
mhm.
that that's the thing that makes us unique. If there is a thing that makes us unique.
What do you believe, if there is a thing? So that's an interesting caveat. What do you believe makes us unique?
Well, I'm gonna. Hmm. I don't like to answer this question because I feel like every single thing that we think has made us unique has been disproven. So I'm
Hmm.
like I'm just not comfortable claiming any
Yeah.
particular facet. One thing that people cite a lot is the our unique ability to manipulate and control our environments, and I think that humans do have a remarkable capacity to manipulate and control the environment. But then you look at something like cyanobacteria, which literally created the conditions for life as we know it today through the great oxidation event. Like that was also a major ability to manipulate and control
Hmm.
the environment. And so compared to cyanobacteria, I'm not really sure we look so unique, right? So, but I guess that would be one domain in which, yeah, compared to many other species alive today, it seems that we are doing a pretty, I don't want to call it exceptional, remarkable, because it's a
Yeah, pretty horrible job. Yeah.
not,
Exceptionally
not
horrible.
necessarily something to be proud of,
Yeah.
transforming the
Fascinating.
environment in which we live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I've long, like, even have it like tattooed across my ribs, this Carl Sagan quote, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." This
Mm,
long sort of standing contemplation, I would say, because it's always evolving for me, that yes, we are made of the stuff of a nuclear furnace of stars, right? And everything in the universe is made of that same stuff.
mhm,
Yet, because of the randomness of human evolution, of all animal evolution, because of the randomness of how these molecular machines organized and then ultimately continuously sort of, I don't want to fought back is not a great way to put it, but against the pressures of selection, we ultimately, and are continuing along this path, are situated in a time right now where we can contemplate on our existence in the universe. We have no idea if animals can do that, right? Because we can't
Right.
talk to them.
Right.
But we have produced content that allows us to know that about ourselves unequivocally. We have poetry, we have literature, we have film, we have art. And that's not to say that other organisms don't have their own versions of that, but
Right.
we know that we have that. And so for that reason, I don't even know if I would call it unique, but I think it's something that we can celebrate, that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself,
Mm.
which to me is actually not a human exceptionalism claim, but it's quite a humbling claim, right? We're made out of all the same stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I'm with you to the extent that it's something that we can celebrate, and it's also not something that we can just outright deny in other species, because how can we really know, right? And it comes back
Mm-hmm.
to this question about do other animals have a concept of birth? And this has been relatively well studied in the comparative thanatology, which is the study of death and death related behaviors. And it's like, do other animals have an understanding of death? And
Mm-hmm.
one angle into this question that I really like is, well, do humans have an understanding of death? Like, we don't have a
Yeah.
universal understanding of death. Do we know what happens? I surely don't really know what
Yeah.
happens. And yeah, I think it's like this humble posture. Maybe other animals' perceptions or understandings of death look very different to ours, and maybe other animals' contemplation of their place in the grand scheme of things looks very different to ours. I'm not really sure, but certainly we can celebrate our own forms of it, and I'm very happy to do so.
I gotta say, woman after my own heart, like now I'm like, how are we going to be able to collaborate from a research perspective? My area of focus, I'm a very newly minted PhD. Well, it's been a couple years now, but
Mhm.
newly finished fellowship and being credentialed at my hospital now. But my area, not only of my research focus, but specifically of my clinical work, is in end of life. And I am fascinated by how we die. I spend a
Yeah.
lot of time with cancer patients who
Oh,
have uh, a not great prognosis. I did my dissertation on medical aid in dying, right? Choosing to
wow.
hasten one's death with the aid of medical intervention to prevent, usually existential suffering. And so
Yeah,
these core concepts are really fascinating to me, but I've
totally.
never thought about how to compare them or how to engage with them from a non-human animal perspective. And now the wheels are turning in my head.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
I'm just I'm so excited by it. So let's get into a little bit more of that. This concept of the arrogant ape. We know that both the scientific and of course the popular literature are like replete with even going back to Darwin and obviously much sooner, like early even Greek philosophers, that
Mhm.
there was this concept that like we are us and we are not just distinct, but actually there was a moral comparison there. Very often we would hear rhetoric that we are better, that we are
Mhm.
superior, right? In all these different ways. And so talk to me a little bit about some of the research that you have found that challenges those perceptions and why it matters to even have this conversation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so just to go back to Aristotle for a moment,
Mm-hmm.
he famously put together this depiction of the biological world called the Scala Naturae. I still don't. I pronounce it so many different ways. I think it's Scala Naturae, but it's a Latin Greek term for um, ladder or scale of life. And
Hmm.
in that depiction, humans were at the top, followed by the other animals who most resemble us, right? So other primates and other large mammals, followed by smaller mammals, and then you have birds and reptiles and fishes. Then you get down to plant life and fungi, and still below that are rocks and other kinds of inorganic matter. And according to Aristotle, this biological classification, which he based on what he could observe in the living world, so only humans and other animals only humans can think rationally, so he thought, and only humans and other animals can move around, which places them above plants. And, plants can reproduce or whatever, which places them above of rocks. And so he based this on certain things he could observe. But part of the Scala Naturae was that the individuals who are higher ranking on the ladder had permission in some ways to use those who were lower in the hierarchy. So humans could use other animals could consume plants, and all the way down. And this image has carried through to it influenced the great chain of being in early Christian thought, and it has lingered even still today in many evolutionary depictions, scientific depictions. In the book, I look at this highly referenced image of, a hunched over great ape, then going all the way up to an upright human. I don't know. Do you know what image I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah. That classic, like as if there was some sort of linear goal-oriented change to when we were our, I guess, ape-like ancestors to now.
Yeah, exactly. Which is it's just not how evolution works. And there's so much research today looking at the cognitive faculties of other animals that shows that actually many of them do have forms of rationality. I skipped many, many steps in my sort of short history lesson on human exceptionalism. One of those steps was the Enlightenment and Cartesian notions of what makes humans special, which was that we have the capacity, for language and therefore reason. And there are linguistic capacities, languages of many other animals. Evidence has come out for sophisticated linguistic capacities, all the different sort of hallmarks we thought made human language special, whether that was semantics or grammar or recursive structures. All of these have been discovered in other animals. And so many of these kind of supposed Rubicons that separate the human mind from the minds of other animals have been dismantled or debunked. And, I would say one of the big ones has to do, and one of the biggest surprises to me, I guess, having also been trained in psychology, we learn so much about the human brain, right? And about what makes it special, and about how that is related to our perhaps superior intelligence. But there's just really not that much, it seems to me, from the evidence that makes the human brain special. And you can find all sorts of different kinds of intelligences with beings who have very different kinds of brains and who may lack brains altogether, such as sponges and, plants, but they're still highly evolved forms of intelligence that you can observe in these so-called simple brained or non-brained species. And so I think that has been one of the biggest and most exciting discoveries for me in researching this book, was just like the supposed correlation between brains and intelligence has to some extent been shattered in my view.
Yeah. So one of the things that I asked earlier that we put the pin in, which I think is so important, is how do you even access the inner workings, the cognition, the emotional life, the rich kind of inner world of an organism who can't, we have a hard enough time, right? I'm a clinical psychologist. I literally do therapy with people, and I have a hard enough time accessing that with people who can just tell me, right? They have a hard enough time going, oh, I don't know what I'm feeling. Yeah. So how on earth do we observe animals in their, native like ecological habitats and draw, I guess, inferences? I think that's maybe a good word to use about what they're thinking, what they're feeling.
Yeah. So my aunt is a clinical psychologist also, and we've had many conversations along these lines. So I think of language as a behavior that is something that is observable, right? It's something that you can kind of measure and observe and experience when someone says something to it. And I think it's one form of evidence. It's one form of behavioral one behavioral form of evidence. And I think there are many, many other behavioral forms of evidence in humans and other species alike. So body language, right? It's like it's called a language for a reason because it's incredibly rich in information. And that's just, one example, but there's also so pupil dilation, the way that individuals are moving. I mean, there's an incredible richness of information that we can gather or glean from to understand the interior experiences of others. And I think this notion that it's just hard, if not impossible, to fully understand the subjective life of another animal because they can't tell us what they're thinking or feeling is, I don't think that language is, and I'm curious to know if you agree from your experience working with patients, but I don't think it's as reliable an indicator of interior experiences as we like to think that it is. I think
absolutely not.
we're like
Absolutely.
notoriously bad at knowing ourselves and knowing our own thoughts and feelings, and let alone communicating them to others. And so actually, going back to my dissertation, when I was studying chimpanzees and humans at the same time, I didn't trust the human data as much because a lot of it was self-reports and surveys and people telling me were they motivated to reconcile or not, as opposed to whether or not they just did it. And in some ways, yeah, I don't necessarily trust language as a way of understanding interior experience as much as I trust other behavioral forms of evidence.
Yeah, and I will say this partly tongue in cheek, but there is a deep truth underneath this, even though it's a flippant comment.
Yeah.
Any woman who has been involved in a heteronormative relationship with a man knows that sometimes it is so obvious what somebody is thinking or feeling when they cannot communicate those same experiences with labels, with verbal communication. And any parent can say that about their children who they know so well. I know that this is because you are hungry, but you cannot communicate that to me. And that is why you are acting like an unholy terror. There are so many examples of times when our behaviors kind of give away an internal state way better than our communicative abilities would. But I also think that part of the human experience, or at least my human experience, and the one that I promote, is working towards finding better linguistic capabilities to describe our inner selves, right? To constantly be interrogating ourselves and looking in the mirror and working towards finding language that better and better approximates. But it's all categories, right? It's all kind of arbitrary. They're all just labels for things that are to some extent ineffable. And we have to just approximate.
Yeah, I like that word, approximate, because I think we have this assumption that language is somehow this direct route, this direct form of access to our inner experience. And that's why I like to think of it as a behavior. It's another indirect form of evidence. And so all we're working with here are various indirect forms of evidence. And that's true when we study other human beings, and that's true when we study other forms of life. So this idea that we can never really, really know what's going on inside of the mind and experience of a chimpanzee, I would say, sure, that's called the problem of other minds in philosophy. I agree with it. And I think that's also true of other humans. And so the problem of other minds is not just something that comes up for other species. It's also true of our fellow humans. And we do the best that we can with these various indirect sources of evidence. We make inferences all the time. We do that with humans all the time. And that's how we relate to one another. And it's part of, the trouble and beauty of living together. Sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we get it wrong.
Absolutely. I feel like, honestly, I feel really humbled by those statements. And I think they're going to encourage me to continue to reflect on the assumptions, or my tendency to take for granted that kind of human behavior is in some way like a better approximation of truth. It's really not. It really isn't. And we are always sort of working to better understand it and to improve it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then, sort of at risk of getting too philosophical, I say that tongue in cheek because I love getting philosophical. What are then the outcomes? We're talking about sort of the mistakes that we've made historically about seeing ourselves as this exceptional creature, as this creature that has like domain, obviously, over the world and that subjugates these other creatures because of our, exceptional intelligence. I'm saying that in quotes, obviously. These thoughts are not occurring in a vacuum. This sort of societal structure that we have, I mean, it's so central that a lot of people take it as essential, right? They don't
Yeah.
even question it.
Yeah.
So to sit back and question these things and really grapple with them is then to crack open a paradigm that can be quite confronting, right? Because it shows that we have been operating in a way that could be seen as deeply unethical, deeply immoral. Like, what are the real consequences of human
Mhm.
exceptionalism? And why does it matter that we have this conversation?
Yeah. So I completely endorse this idea that human exceptionalism is kind of nowhere and everywhere all at once. It's
Mm-hmm.
hidden in plain sight. It shapes and dictates so much of what we do, and yet so many of us often don't even know that we believe it or have these assumptions. And I think it's problematic for a number of reasons. In the book, the central argument of the book is actually that beliefs in human exceptionalism are at the root of the ecological crisis. And I use the phrase at the root very deliberately because I think the root of the ecological crisis is multifaceted, has so many
Mm-hmm.
different layers, and many of them are interconnected. But I think human exceptionalism is at the root and connected with many of the other causes of the ecological crisis. I think it's a cosmology, a worldview that makes the exploitation of other forms of life who are deemed subhuman. And I think it's important to qualify that that can be other human beings as well who don't necessarily count as fully human, right? They're considered animals, and we see that all the time in our rhetoric towards human outgroups, that they are acting like rats or pests or
Of
vermin,
course, yeah.
right?
It's
So
a
that's
political tool, of course,
yeah, and it's not
in service to genocide, honestly.
right, exactly. But it's incredibly telling, right, that we use that language.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that many of these conflicts and these ways of dehumanizing others are resting upon a false dichotomy between human and animal in the first place,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there's been plenty of research showing that when people believe more in evolutionary continuity, when they understand more about human-animal similarities, not only are they more likely to treat other animals better, but they're more likely to treat human outgroups better as well. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot that would suggest that human exceptionalism, this supposed superiority and separateness of humans from other animals and the rest of nature, is incredibly problematic in our treatment of other species and the environment, and also of other humans. And then a sub-theme or argument of the book is that human exceptionalism has seeped into the way that we do science. And so another outcome, I believe, of this worldview is that it biases our science, and that in overcoming this belief, learning sort of how to see past or through, the basic way our sense of the world has been framed by human exceptionalism, leads to better science as well, because it helps us be more aware of our own biases. For one, the one that we just spoke about, right? That, we can only understand what humans think. We can't understand what other animals think because of language. Well, I think that is a bias of human exceptionalism that undermines and in some cases denies the mental life of other
Mm-hmm.
beings. And it's not rational. It's not good. It's problematic ethically, but again, it's not good science to say that, because we're always working with indirect forms and imperfect forms of evidence, no matter if it's humans or other species. And so by illuminating those kinds of biases and bringing them to light, we actually, I think, pave the way to do better science as well.
Ugh, Such an important, fundamental point that honestly, I think it bears repeating again and again. I'm glad that you wrote the book. I'm glad that you're continuing to publish and to write in sort of more popular outlets. And I hope that you continue to have these conversations across platforms, to give talks, to continue to train a generation of scientists to at least consider this fundamental paradigm shift, because I think with this kind of I keep using words like provocative. It's not provocative. I think it just is. But for a lot of people, it shakes the kind of foundational core
Mhm.
of the way that they think. And sometimes it takes hearing something like this, literally 100 times
Yeah.
before it does sink in. You can't just hear it once. And so we
Mhm.
having these conversations. And I just have to say, I'm both grateful and also like really, really in awe of that the type of work that you're doing, because I think it's really fundamentally important. So, gosh, just thank you. First of all, thank you for being here today. Thank you for doing all of the hard work to write this book. Thank you for continuing along this academic path. And, you know, it's not an easy thing to operate both within academia and try and, really keep kind of making these claims and keep getting people within these academic circles to think differently, but also then stepping outside of that ivory tower and communicating these ideas to a broader audience. I think it's so important. So thank you for all of your hard work in this, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. It was also great to hear about the work that you're doing. I think importantly, humans are animals, so you're working with other animals in your own field, and I think that is we're all doing what we can to change the conversation and to enhance the
Absolutely.
conversation.
Absolutely. Everybody, the book is The Arrogant Ape, The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters by Dr. Christine E. Webb. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.